Hello, my name is Stephen Hughes. I'm from the Department of Language and Literature Teaching and Learning at the University of Granada in Spain. And I'd like to welcome you today to this presentation, which forms part of this year's learning conference within the framework of intercultural learning in plurilingual contexts. Before I begin, I'd like to take the opportunity, of course, to thank the organisers of this conference for having invited me once again to speak here, albeit in very special circumstances. It's great to be back, and I hope you're all finding the format accessible and useful. I have to say that this particular field of study, intercultural learning in plurilingual contexts, is of interest to me, as I'm sure it is to you, and particularly to our respective educational administrations. Cultural awareness and expression are key areas. In fact, it's a key competence in Europe, one which helps us to understand others, maybe even help us to slip into their shoes for a while. It increases our enrichment at so many different levels, socially, emotionally, intellectually, creatively. And in this presentation, I'm very happy to discuss the aspect of plurilingual and pluricultural competence from the educational perspective of Spain, which enjoys both a tradition of language teaching and learning, as well as a relatively well-established program for plurilingual education through non-language subjects. I think this is an interesting area. We've got interrelated educational paths that both tread firmly, in theory at least, on the territory of intercultural learning. So before going into the main content of this presentation, I'd just like to give a general sense as to where we're going, and at the same time mention some of the key terms that we'll be using. I briefly alluded to this at the beginning. The two main areas will be language learning on the one hand, often expressed as L2, but also it could be L3. And on the other hand, content and language integrated learning, which I'll refer to quite often as CLIL, maybe perhaps sometimes as bilingual education. In the first case then, we're referring to those instructional scenarios where students are learning a non-native, normally a majority language. Here in Spain, for example, we would typically see the L1 as being Spanish, the L2 English, and the L3 French. In the second case, CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning, we're referring to what we could call a European brand of bilingual or plurilingual instruction in non-language classes, such as history, biology, or music, for example. And the first thing I want to look at in this presentation are some of those shared and diverging interests between these two areas, touching on commonalities, for example, such as the introduction of common key competences for lifelong learning, as well as differences, particularly in the treatment of content. And while this discussion will provide a general overview of these shared and diverging areas, there will be a special focus too on the component of culture, how it might be introduced and understood in class. And once we've looked at these two major educational scenarios, we'll move on to examine two pieces of research conducted here in Spain, which I've been personally involved in, one on a more general whole school and national level, and the other at a particular subject level, which is a more localized study. And again, we'll examine some of the major areas of interest, but also focus where possible on those components which are directly or indirectly related to intercultural learning. Now, from the offset, I would say that our findings within these investigations point to the need for teacher development, both in general methodological terms and within these in terms of the explicit and real inclusion of the cultural dimension. So this presentation will end with a number of recommendations in that direction. So we'll begin with the first of these areas, which is that of language learning. And we'll take a general overview of this as a subject area, looking firstly at major recent developments and then examining where culture actually fits in. I think our first and most important port of call with language learning is a document called the Common European Framework. You may already be familiar with this, and you may or may not know that this framework has had a recent major update in the form of what we call what's called the companion volume with new descriptors. So the Common European Framework established initially the 6 levels that we had of language learning, going from A2 beginner level up to C2, which was a more advanced level or proficient level. And the updated document, among the most relevant changes that we have the description of plurilingual and pluricultural competence. We have updated indicators, the inclusion of more modern technologies that we're using today and which reflect the reality of teaching and learning, including audiovisual and online learning. But perhaps one of the most important changes that has appeared with this companion volume is the introduction of this paradigm of receptive, productive, interactive and mediation skills, which we'll discuss briefly very shortly. So, as we can see from the Council of Europe's own affirmation, plurilingual and pluricultural competence go hand in hand. Thus, when plurilingual competence is mentioned in the Common European Framework, pluricultural competence is also implied. But we're going to have a look and see exactly how this plurilingual and pluricultural competence goes together. We'll just step back briefly from this dual paradigm of plurilingual and pluricultural competence to look at the 4 major pillars on which this new companion volume stands. Traditionally, and I don't mean traditionally going very far back into grammar translation methods and things like that, very traditional methods, but traditionally in relatively modern language teaching, language learning has been based around a set of pillars which were listening, speaking, reading and writing. Many pieces of legislation are still based around this paradigm. The Common European Framework, however, brings a paradigm shift and says that this is no longer enough to explain and develop language learning. So essentially what the Common European Framework does is to divide the skills into 4 blocks. Receptive skills, which deal with listening, reading, audiovisual comprehension. Production, speaking and writing. Interaction, which for example has oral interaction, written interaction and online interaction. And a relatively new concept, at least within language learning, is that of mediation, where you have mediation of texts, mediation of concepts and mediation of communication. These terms have been around for a while, but it's the first time that we have a solid reference to it at a pan-European level. And we will see these aspects introduced into legislation explicitly if that has not already been done. So the Common European Framework gives a number of recommendations in terms of these 4 areas. And we're going to see some of those recommendations in a moment. In fact, we're going to see a slide which has some recommended activities and recommended strategies for each of the 4 blocks. And I'm going to present the next slide, and you shouldn't worry if you're not able to see it. There's a reason for the text size, which I'll be showing in a second. But it's just to give us a general overview of these 4 areas and how culture might fit into them. So essentially, we've got receptive activities, receptive strategies, productive activities and strategies, interactive activities and strategies, mediation activities and strategies. These are all extracted from the Common European Framework. So some examples, for example, receptive reading for orientation or listening to audio, media and recording could be an example of receptive activity. A productive activity, providing a sustained monologue describing an experience. An interactive activity could be interviewing and being interviewed. Mediation, note-taking, group collaboration, acting as an intermediary, etc. Now, within these activities and strategies, the Common European Framework mentions the word culture explicitly only once. And this is a little bit like Where's Wally? If we can find it, we can see that there's one small reference to culture, which is that of facilitating pluricultural space, and that's within the set of mediation skills. But of course, that is not to say that culture is not present. If we take a closer look at some of these activities, we can see, for example, in the case of interaction, there's a potential for cultural content in each and every one of these activities. Conversation, we can imagine cultural content there. Interviewing and being interviewed, of course. So the potential for inclusion of culture is virtually limitless, in theory at least. Where is this cultural content limited then? Perhaps in those situations in which the learner, or worse still the teacher, focuses primarily on linguistic activities, such as grammar, vocabulary, and not on communication, or, as the Common European Framework would suggest, on reception, production, interaction, and mediation. So culture is a normal part of foreign language learning. So fortunately, there is a heightened awareness of the need for this communication to take place, and for culture to be integrated there. And this has become enshrined in educational legislation. So part of that legislation also highlights the need for the development of cultural awareness and expression as a key competence. For example, in the specific case of Andalusia, regional legislation makes a specific reference to this. Cultural awareness and expression is present in the first foreign language and the second foreign language. It's very similar for that as well. And it involves activities such as artistic and cultural manifestations, songs, drama, films, gastronomy, festivals. So for the language teacher, it's normal to see cultural awareness and expression as part of their curriculum and part of their obligation as a teacher to include. This key competence, however, goes across the curriculum in all subject areas. However, it might be perhaps more difficult to integrate in some subjects than in others. So we know that culture is an intrinsic part of language education. It's mentioned in the Common European Framework. It's integrated into national and regional legislation. Another thing is the degree to which it is actually taken on board in instructional settings, but we'll come to that later. But right now we're going to focus on the other side of the coin, which is the major components in content and language integrated learning. Now, while we don't have the time to go into a great deal of detail here, some important characteristics will be mentioned, including the aspect of culture. And this will be compared to evidence on the ground as to what's actually happening in relation to these considerations in the classroom. So probably the most important framework, or the most well-known framework upon which CLIL is based, is that of the 4 C's. 4 C's are content, communication, cognition, and culture. These 4 C's have been around for a number of years. Doug Coyle and David Marsh mentioned them in various documents during the 2000s. And a particularly important reference or an important manual for those interested in this area is that provided by Coyle, Hood, and Marsh in 2010. So the 4 C's essentially speaks for themselves. Content, we're talking about a subject which has contents that must be acquired by the students. In the acquisition of these contents, we obviously go through a process of communication, which deals with reception, production, interaction, and mediation. At the same time, there's a focus on cognition, whereby we're trying to help students develop their higher order thinking skills, or the HOTS, as opposed to these lower order thinking skills, which are still important, but rather than focus solely on those lower order thinking skills, we want students to be more cognitively competent. And then we've got this last spoke of the wheel, which is culture. And this component is perhaps one of the more difficult ones for content and language learners, content teachers, to actually incorporate into their teaching, as we'll see in a minute. Again, our focus will be on culture. And among other areas, we can discuss culture as being something that's related to respect and acceptance of our own culture and other cultures. Essentially, when we begin dealing with culture, we recognize the importance of our own culture, and that helps our students to know that their own culture forms part of their identity. And when dealing with another culture, we're not asking them to relinquish that identity, but to reaffirm it as a first step towards the acceptance of otherness in other cultures. There are many ways in which we can incorporate culture into the classroom. For example, the use of authentic source resources, project work are two ways in which we can do this. Finding and being on the lookout for opportunities to make cultural connections. And of course, all of this provides a number of diverse learning perspectives. Now, if we step back from culture for a second and we look at the general question of content and language integrated learning, we need to recognize that there are a series of challenges which can threaten learners' development in all four areas of content, communication, cognition, and culture. For example, the acceptance from different sectors of society and school communities. We have, on a regular basis in the press, arguments in favour of and against bilingual education. Within school communities, you can have teachers in favour of it and teachers who are against it. Parents, students themselves. Another challenge is the availability of particularly human resources for the job of teaching within those classes. And the first obvious area is the linguistic or the communicative competence of the teachers. In addition to that competence level, we've got the availability of appropriate resources, including authentic materials. And a lot of this boils down to the appropriate training for teachers. If we've got the given that teachers have the language level, appropriately trained teachers are going to be able to find the necessary resources in order to be able to make the content and language integrated learning class successful. So this area of training is perhaps the most important challenge. And indeed, I mean, whether teachers have received sufficient training or not is perhaps the major question. Generally speaking, at least when it comes to secondary education, for example, these more specialised classes, for example, language teachers receive initial training in language teaching. Geography teachers receive initial training in geography teaching. But what about CLIL teachers? It's often the case that CLIL teachers are thrown into the deep end. They have to hit the ground running and learning along the way. Sometimes they might have a crash course, which teachers may or may not be required to do. So it's not as systematic as other forms of teacher education. So that leads us to two questions. What training do teachers actually get in terms of CLIL, or what training do they need, and how might this affect what goes on in the class? This in turn leads us to a third question, and that's connected to the thematic contents of this conference, which is how might this affect cultural and intercultural learning? So in this presentation, I'd like to look at two studies in which I've been involved. The first is a national study that is also mentioned in this conference by Dr. Ortega, although my focus here will be more on the cultural component. So this first case is a national study at a whole school level within secondary education. It examines the implementation of CLIL in content and language subjects. There's a relatively large sample of almost 1,600 students, 121 language teachers, 158 content teachers, 37 bilingual coordinators and 72 head teachers. And we sampled these groups through interviews and questionnaires. A very contrasting study is one that we completed recently, which deals with the specific subject of physical education and CLIL. We had a sample of 39 physical education teachers from primary and secondary education from a total of 26 schools. And again, we used interviews and questionnaires for them. So we'll begin by looking at certain aspects of the national study conducted in bilingual schools in Spain. Here, there was a focus on the areas of leadership, culture, teachers, planning, results, etc. But here I would like to focus specifically on that of culture and teachers. In addition to that, there'll be an examination of the of the cultural component in terms of student perceptions and perhaps teacher needs. So one of the questions we asked learners was how often certain activities or activity types were carried out both in the CLIL class and in the language class. We can see from the graph on the left, which deals with the CLIL class, we have a number of different types of activities which are frequently employed. For example, reading is a frequent activity, writing as well. Out of all of them, the least frequent activity was those which was related to other cultures. It's not an excessively low number, but it was the lowest of the whole group of questions that were posed to students. In terms of the language class, the results are not particularly surprising. We can see that there is a high level of frequency in activities related to the 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In the past, this may have been different, and there might have been a greater level of vocabulary, grammar activities than would be perhaps represented in this scale. And that seems to suggest that communicative language practices are taking hold within the classroom. But if we look at the final, on the far left of this graph, we've got culture and contact with L2 cultures at the lowest levels, under 3 points. So that would seem to suggest that even though culture and language are intertwined, etc., the explicit treatment of culture, or at least students' perception of culture being treated in the classroom, is comparatively lower than other activity types. Some of the areas of improvement that were detected by learners, or suggested by learners, were, for example, the need for higher levels of L2 in the L1 class. Here we're talking about particularly the CLIL class. The language proficiency of some of the teachers, again, this deals with the CLIL class. The need for more native speakers or assistants, language assistants in the class. An increase in exchange projects. This was suggested by both students from CLIL classes and students discussing the language class. And the explicit inclusion of culture-related activities. That was particularly mentioned in the question of the language class. So teachers also had somewhat overlapping suggestions. But there was a particular concern here also for the need for more training to be provided from the educational administration. They also suggested the possibility of teacher exchange and more inter-school collaboration, in addition to higher levels of interdepartmental collaboration and coordination, particularly with those teachers who are working together in the bilingual program. And essentially higher levels of training for content teachers. Now we're going to move on to case number 2. Again, as I mentioned before, this is a more limited and localized study, but it might help us to target one of those subject areas which is considered to be potentially a good candidate for content and language integrated learning, which is physical education. In this study, our focus was on how physical education contributed to the development of communicative competence, particularly in the light of this paradigm offered by the Council of Europe. At the same time, however, we also wanted to know more about the levels of teacher competence or self-perceived competence in terms of CLIL methodology. So firstly, we looked at the profile of the teachers in this sample. And we find that the language level of teachers in comparison to previous studies that we've conducted was relatively high. The majority of teachers had a B2 level, which is the minimum requirement for a bilingual teacher here in Spain. Some teachers had a total of 4 of the group of teachers had a C1 level, 8 C2 levels, and there was 1 native speaker. So in relative terms, we've seen an improvement in the language or the communicative competence profile of teachers in the system. But in terms of training, things weren't quite as homogeneous, let's say. We asked how many had received bilingual training. 16 of the participants said that they had received bilingual training or training in CLIL and bilingual methodology, and 23 said that they had not. And this was perhaps a cause of concern. We also asked them how confident they felt in relation to their own knowledge and competence, both in terms of language skills and in CLIL methodology. Here we can see that there are relatively high scores out of a maximum of 5 in terms of communicative and linguistic elements, such as giving instructions, assessing through writing, etc. But the lowest score was that of their own self-perceived competence in terms of or knowledge of CLIL methodology. And this would seem to reflect their own perceptions in terms of the training and experience that they had in both languages and CLIL methodology. Now, all of these teachers are expected to elaborate yearly planning documents. And out of these documents, we asked what type of elements that they included in them. Now, the frequency with which these teachers included communicative and linguistic elements, well, particularly linguistic elements. Linguistic elements refers to vocabulary, structures, grammar, etc. And perhaps the high score that we can see here is due to the fact that CLIL teachers often try to think about what type of terminology students are going to need. So it's obvious that the linguistic elements is going to be an important part. Communicative elements, listening, speaking, reading, writing, etc. might be of less importance to them, although they're going to be using them all the time. And CLIL methodological elements, the frequency is relatively low there. There doesn't seem to be as big a concern, for example, for CLIL methodological elements as there are for linguistic elements. Now, this chart reflects teacher perceptions on the frequency with which certain skills are used. And right away we can see that in the class, the most common or frequently employed skill is that of listening. Now, this would be obvious. The subject is PE. It's an outdoors activity and it often relies on teacher instructions. Indeed, when we think of the late 20th century teaching approaches, that of Asher's total physical response could come to mind. At the other end of the scale, we've got online interaction. Again, this could be considered somewhat normal due to the characteristics of physical education. Technically speaking, this last point on mediation of communication, this is the area where the creation of pluricultural spaces would be involved, theoretically, if we think back to the table related to the Common European Framework activities and strategies. Indeed, in the question, or the item for this question, we make explicit mention of culture. It's essentially asking students, or asking the teachers how often the mediation of communication takes place. For example, acting as an intermediary, facilitating communication in difficult situations, facilitating intercultural communication. So less than 3 out of 5 points is relatively a low score. In terms of open-ended responses, the 39 teachers gave a number of different answers, but there were repeated patterns of major categories. For example, there was a disparity in training, in planning, where, for example, 11 of the teachers said that they had exactly the same planning for physical education in English as in Spanish, and the question arises, should it actually be that way? Should it be the same? 10 teachers said that they had specific contents chosen for physical education in English, so there's a certain disparity there. And the other is in their methodological preparedness. 15 of the teachers said that they felt confident in relation to planning. 10 did not feel confident or felt that their planning skills was improvable, and 11 expressed, apart from having expressed it in the Likert scale, they also reiterated the fact that they had received no training. So what suggestions could we make in terms of CLIL and culture? Well, we would have two general areas. Firstly, in terms of CLIL, we would suggest that there be extra training provided for teachers in terms of methodology, focusing on these four basic pillars of CLIL, which is how to deal with content, communication, culture, and cognition within their different classes, be it biology, physical education, music, history, or whatever. Also, how to incorporate these elements within their planning to ensure that they're actually carried out. This training could also help them to locate and be able to use high quality and appropriate materials, and help them to develop a program of continuous evaluation so that they can assess how things are going and make improvements there. In terms of culturally specific measures, we could also adopt the paradigm that's offered by the Common European Framework and try and find opportunities to encounter and express cultural components through receptive, productive, interactive, and mediation activities. In addition to that, a major aspect mentioned by teachers and students alike, and something that governments are also insisting on, is the contact with the world outside. Ways in which we can do that is to increase the amount of authentic online resources that are being used, improve as much as we can, or increase as much as we can, the number of conversation assistants or cultural visitors to the classroom, increase the amount of inter-school projects and teacher exchanges, etc. These are some of the basic measures that we might need to include in future teacher training programs, particularly for content and language integrated learning teachers. I've run out of time for this presentation, and I hope you found it useful. But if you do have any extra questions or comments that you would like to make, please feel free to write to me. You've got the address here. Again, it's been a pleasure to have been invited here and to be able to speak to you today. I hope it was useful for you, and I look forward to hearing any of your comments that you may have. Thank you very much.